The church smelled of lilies and lemon oil, too clean for sorrow. The organist played softly, and the hymn books rasped as people turned pages they wouldn't sing from. I stood in the front pew, my black dress neatly pressed, my hands trembling only when I reached for the Bible. It was Daniel's, the same one I gave him for Christmas in 1992, back when his promotion to vice president at the bank made us feel like the world was finally safe. The leather cover was cracked and soft, the gold edges dulled from years of use. I opened it to Psalms, because that's what widows do when they don't know what else to say. A small index card slipped free and landed near my shoe. I bent down to pick it up, thinking it was another condolence verse from a church friend. When I turned it over, my blood ran cold. If she finds out, end it before Thursday. 7 words, blue ink. The familiar right-leaning loops of Daniel's handwriting, I'd recognize them anywhere. My pulse thudded against my ribs. The funeral was on a Thursday. Today was Thursday. Robert, my son, leaned over and whispered, "Mom, Dad loved you more than anything." His hand pressed my shoulder gently, unaware of the storm in my chest. I tucked the note into my clutch beside a peppermint and forced a nod. Around us, the town gathered bank clients, church ladies, old students, all smiling the way people do when they think death makes saints. Across the aisle stood the bank's board chairman, his navy suit too perfect, his anchor-pattern tie shining under the lights. He gave me a slow nod, polite, practiced. I smiled back, though my lips had gone dry. Behind him, I thought I saw the ghost of Evelyn Daniels' young assistant, who disappeared years ago only to realize it was just another woman in a dark hat. Still, Evelyn's name echoed in my mind. The last time I saw her was after choir rehearsal, her lipstick the color of pomegranate, her shoes left in the hallway after she left town. The pastor's voice brought me back. "Would you like to share a few words, Mrs. Whitaker?" he asked gently. "Tomorrow," I said, though no one had mentioned tomorrow. My voice came out too firm. I could feel eyes on me, pitying, guessing. I placed the Bible down, clutch trembling, and forced a calm smile. After the service, people pressed my hands, offered casseroles and condolences. "He was such a good man," they kept saying, as if repeating it could make it true. The board chairman shook my hand and said, "There'll be a quick meeting tomorrow to finalize the trust." His tone was polite, but I caught the impatience under it. Routine, he'd called it. That word always meant someone wanted me to sign something without asking questions. Robert promised to handle the papers. He was always loyal to his father, believing every word Daniel spoke. I didn't blame him. To everyone, Daniel was the pillar banker, deacon, coach, the kind of man whose obituary reads like scripture. But pillars can hide rot. At home that night, I set the Bible on my nightstand. The house felt too large, every creak an echo. The refrigerator hummed, the faucet dripped things Daniel had promised to fix. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the note. The handwriting was his. The meaning I couldn't grasp. If she finds out, end it before Thursday. Who was she? Me? Evelyn? And what was supposed to end? My mind refused to stop circling the words. I imagined Daniel sitting at his desk late at night, pen scratching paper, sweat darkening his collar. I imagined Evelyn finding something she shouldn't have. Or maybe she'd found me. In the mirror, my reflection looked older than 72. My hair, silver where it used to be gold, framed a face that had taught children for 40 years to trust the truth of words. Yet here I was, holding one I couldn't understand. I pressed it to my chest until the edges left a faint mark. A memory surfaced. Summer 2011. Detective Harris, once my prom date, now a tired-eyed man in a county badge, had come to the porch, asking if Daniel knew anything about irregularities at the bank. I remember Daniel laughing it off, saying it was just paperwork. Harris looked at me then, not him, and said, "If anything seems off, you call me." I never did. I made a pot roast instead. I took the note to the kitchen and laid it beside the salt shaker. The clock ticked toward 9. I poured tea I wouldn't drink and thought of Evelyn again. She'd been young, careful, loyal, and then gone. Her disappearance had been the kind of story the town talked about for a week before moving on. Daniel told me she'd eloped. I wanted to believe that. Maybe I needed to. Now I wasn't sure. I placed the note inside the Bible, then pulled it back out. If Daniel had wanted it hidden, why leave it there? If someone else had written it, why choose the Bible, the one I always opened? A chill moved through me. The ink was faint but not faded. It hadn't been there long. Outside, a dog barked, and a freight train moaned across the river. I thought of how Daniel used to count each whistle before rolling over in his sleep. He was a man who measured everything: budgets, golf strokes, blessings. I had measured too, but in smaller ways. The number of sandwiches packed, the birthdays forgotten, the promises postponed. I looked again at the note and whispered, "What did you do, Daniel?" The air didn't answer. The house, old and obedient, kept its silence. I climbed into bed but didn't close my eyes. Each time I tried, I saw Evelyn's shoes and Daniel's pen. I saw Thursday written like a deadline. My heart beat louder than the rain starting against the window. If she finds out, end it before Thursday. It didn't sound like my husband's voice. Not the man who said grace before dinner, who kissed my cheek in public, who told everyone he adored me. Yet it looked like him, his hand on the page, his words in my palm. I reached for the lamp and turned it off. The room filled with shadows, thick and listening. I didn't pray, I just breathed and waited. And then the thought came, cold and certain. If Daniel had been the man I believed him to be, there'd be nothing to hide. But he had hidden this. I lay there, eyes open to the dark, the note pressed under my pillow like proof and punishment. How could my own family do this? People remember marriages and anniversaries, trips, or photographs. I remember mine in receipts. 40 years of grocery lists, tuition bills, utility statements, each one signed in my careful script because Daniel said my handwriting looked trustworthy. When I look back, it's the numbers that tell the story of how much I gave: $18,400 from my teacher's retirement fund in 1998 to cover an investment gap, $2,750 from selling my mother's wedding pearls to replace the roof after the insurance claim mysteriously fell through. Each time, Daniel said, "Just until the next quarter closes, Maggie. Then we'll be fine." We were always on the verge of fine. I taught 7th grade literature for 41 years in the same brick building, with windows that never quite closed right. My salary was small but steady, and I believed in steady things. I made turkey sandwiches every morning, packed his lunch beside mine, and slipped in a folded note that said, "Proud of you." He said it made the other men laugh. I told him that was fine, pride doesn't need an audience. Our house was modest but neat. A 3-bedroom colonial on a tree-lined street, blue shutters, white trim, the kind of place people pointed to and said, "That's what stability looks like." I painted the kitchen myself twice, butter yellow, then sage green, and baked every Thursday, because he liked the smell of bread when he came home. Thursday, the word again. That same day in every story of my life, circling back like a warning. Evelyn appeared in our lives the year I turned 60. She was Daniel's new assistant, 28, efficient, polite, pretty in a quiet way, with pearl earrings and a small silver cross at her throat. She came to our house for dinner once. I remember she brought a pie cherry, homemade, and Daniel complimented it too many times. He wasn't unfaithful then, at least not that I could prove, but something shifted that evening. When she left, I noticed he lingered at the door longer than good manners required. Still, I believed in him. In his way of tapping his pen against the table when he was thinking, in the soft whistle he made when trimming hedges. I believed because belief is what wives are taught to offer when truth is inconvenient. When rumors surfaced, later whispers about missing funds, an audit inquiry, a bank clerk reassigned suddenly, Daniel told me people were jealous. "I'm the only one who keeps the place honest," he said. "They can't stand that." I nodded, even as I ironed his shirts and noticed the faint chemical scent that clung to the cuffs. Not from home, but from the bank's dry cleaning service. He worked late most nights that year. I'd sit on the porch grading essays while the streetlights hummed on. Once, I saw his car parked outside the bank at midnight when I went to return a library book. He told me later he'd been finishing a report. I didn't ask why the office lights were off. The last normal Christmas we had was 2010. I bought him a new leather briefcase and tucked a small note inside the pocket. For every plan that worked and every one that didn't, I still believe in you. He laughed when he found it, kissed my forehead and said, "You always make me feel lucky." That night he drank more wine than usual and stayed up watching the news long after I went to bed. I woke to find him asleep in his chair, the Bible open on his lap. I didn't know until years later that it was the same Bible where the note would wait for me. When Evelyn disappeared the following summer, the town barely paused. Daniel said she'd moved to Raleigh to take care of her mother. The church prayed for her once, then forgot her name. Only I noticed how Daniel flinched when someone mentioned her, how he burned her choir robe in the backyard because mildew had set in. He did it at dusk while I was washing dishes. I saw the smoke from the window. The fabric turned to gray curls that glowed red before falling apart. In those years, I measured my life by small savings: a jar of quarters labeled vacation, a modest 401, stacks of graded essays bundled in twine. Daniel handled the rest. "You're good at words, Maggie," he used to say. "Let me handle the numbers." And I let him, because I wanted to believe he was still the man who held my hand through miscarriages and prayed with me when my sister died, because sometimes trust is easier than proof. After he passed, the town praised him like a saint. "Daniel built this community," they said, "a man of faith and fairness." I stood by his casket and wondered how many of them knew what faith costs. How much fairness is worth when it's balanced against the wrong side of a ledger. That night, I opened the drawer of his desk, something I hadn't done in years. Inside, neatly stacked envelopes of old statements, bank meeting minutes, and a blue folder labeled Whitaker Foundation. The edges were dustless, as if recently handled. I flipped through until I reached one letter written in his tidy cursive. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a line across the top. "Evelyn draft unsent." My breath caught. I didn't read it then. I couldn't. I slid it back under the pile, closed the drawer, and locked it. I kept thinking about the word Thursday. Daniel's favorite day for everything golf, church finance meetings, dinners with the board. Even the funeral had fallen on a Thursday. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, but coincidence feels thin when grief keeps poking holes in it. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the note again. The ink had faded at the edges where my fingers had rubbed it. I noticed the paper wasn't yellowed, not like something 20 years old. The handwriting was fresh. I thought of how Daniel had hidden it, not in a drawer or safe, but in the Bible, the one I would inevitably open. Was it meant for me? A warning? A confession? The clock struck 10. Outside, wind moved through the magnolia tree and brushed the window like a whisper. I thought about all the years I'd told my students that literature teaches us the difference between appearance and truth. Now I realized I'd been living a novel I couldn't grade. I took one of Daniel's old ledgers from the closet, the one bound in brown leather with a silver clasp. Inside were pages of tidy handwriting, months of transactions, numbers in blue ink. But one page was missing, torn clean out. The next began with a line in pencil: "Sweep completed. Adjust before Thursday." My pulse quickened. The same word again. I pressed my palm against the empty space where the page had been. Maybe Evelyn had seen this. Maybe that's why she left. I imagined her handwriting graceful, deliberate, and wondered if it still existed somewhere. If she had written anything that could tell me what Thursday meant. I closed the book and carried it upstairs. On the nightstand, the Bible waited under the lamp. I placed the ledger beside it, side by side scripture and arithmetic, love and deceit. I turned off the light, but sleep didn't come. The house creaked as if remembering too much. I lay awake, thinking of every sacrifice I'd made and how easily it could vanish into paper. I'd given Daniel my savings, my trust, my youth. Now I had his secrets, and I wasn't sure which cost more. Tomorrow, I decided, I would call Detective Harris, but before I did, I wanted to read that letter to Evelyn, the one marked draft unsent. Because somewhere between those pages, I knew the truth had been waiting, just like that note in the Bible, for me to finally look. It started with small things, the kind of things you could explain away if you wanted to, and I did. I wanted to. The first time was when Daniel came home later than usual, smelling faintly of the bank's lobby, that metallic blend of paper, printer ink, and cologne. He said the system crashed again, that he and the IT boy were reconciling off-balance accounts. I believed him because I'd spent my life believing the words of men who said they were fixing things. But the late nights multiplied. The lights at the bank burned long after closing. From my window, I could see the building's tall windows glowing like an accusation. Once, when I dropped off dinner, a casserole in a glass dish wrapped with a towel, I saw him through the glass conference room door, talking to someone. A woman. She stood close, one hand on the table, her head tilted in the soft, listening way women use when they want to be kind. When Daniel spotted me in the doorway, he flinched, then smiled too quickly. "Staff audit meeting," he said later. "You wouldn't have been interested." A week after that, I found a gold earring back under our foyer rug. It wasn't mine. I kept it in a small glass jar above the sink where I used to collect buttons. Every time I washed dishes, it glittered like a question I couldn't ask. I told myself Evelyn was just a hard-working assistant, devoted like he said she was. Still, her name came up often. Evelyn filed this, Evelyn fixed that, Evelyn caught an error. He spoke her name like a charm. I told myself to be grateful that he respected capable women, but gratitude curdled into something else when she stopped coming to church. Then there was the ledger. A brown, buckled volume Daniel kept locked in his study. I wasn't supposed to touch it, he said. It held confidential client data. But one morning, dusting the desk while he showered, I noticed the strap unbuckled. The first page was filled with neat columns of figures, all even, all balanced. The second showed a pattern of withdrawals: $2,100, $2,050, $1,900, repeating every Thursday. The same day again. I remember running my finger down the page and whispering the word under my breath like it might explain itself Thursday. When I asked Daniel about it that evening, he said it was an automated sweep. Then he laughed and kissed my forehead. "You really should have worked in finance, Maggie." That night, I dreamed of numbers raining from the ceiling like confetti, falling faster and faster until I couldn't breathe. Weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to the estate of Daniel Whitaker. I assumed it was another condolence note, but when I opened it, I found only a single sheet of paper with no sender name. It read, in typed text, "Ask about July 2011. There was no signature, no return address. I folded it in half and hid it between the pages of my old yearbook, just above my picture in the faculty section. The date struck me 2011, the same summer Evelyn disappeared, the same year Detective Harris had come to our porch asking questions. He'd said then it was just a routine inquiry, but I remembered his eyes. They were the kind that have seen enough of people's worst truths to recognize another one coming. I found his old card in my desk drawer. Detective William Harris, County Financial Crimes Division. The corner was bent, the ink fading. I thought of calling him that night but didn't. I wasn't ready for confirmation. I just needed one more reason to stop pretending. That reason came a few days later. Robert visited to help with the bills. He'd taken over sorting the estate documents, though he wasn't much better with numbers than I was. While looking through a stack of bank statements, he frowned. "Mom, did Dad have a secondary account at Melrose Savings?" I shook my head. "No, everything was at First County." "Why?" He hesitated. "Because there are transfers from First County to Melrose under your name. Regular ones." "My name?" I asked. "Yeah, Maggie L. Whitaker. Look." He slid the paper toward me. The print was faint but legible, $1,200 every Thursday. I stared until the figures blurred. "Maybe he was saving something for you," Robert said, smiling the nervous smile of a boy caught between comfort and doubt. "Dad liked surprises." He did, but not the kind that left fingerprints on ledgers and earring backs under rugs. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house with a flashlight, opening drawers as if the answers might hide in silverware or linen. I ended up in his study again. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, each second louder than the last. The ledger was gone from its usual place. In its spot lay a single folded sheet. My stomach tightened when I opened it. It wasn't a ledger page this time, but a copy of a bank memo. Client sweep batch C pending approval. Hold until Thursday. The signature at the bottom was Daniel's. Underneath, in smaller writing, another hand had scrawled, "Check Evelyn's report before signing." The handwriting was faint, the ink lighter as though the person who wrote it didn't want to be seen. I traced the letters with my finger. It wasn't Daniel's handwriting. It looked feminine, smaller, rounder. For a long moment I stood still, the sound of the clock beating like a pulse. When I placed the note down, my hand brushed against something tucked behind a row of books, a small, flat envelope. Inside was a photo from a church picnic. Daniel, smiling too broadly, standing beside Evelyn. His hand hovered near her shoulder, not quite touching, but near enough to make me flinch. On the back, in my own handwriting, I'd written the date. July 2011, the same date on the anonymous letter. The same date in the memo. I set the photo beside the open Bible on the desk and whispered, "What happened that summer, Daniel?" The room gave no answer, only the faint sound of cicadas from the trees outside, and the slow, steady drip of the faucet I'd been meaning to fix since spring. I knew then that whatever had started with Evelyn hadn't ended when she disappeared. It had just gone quiet. Before going to bed, I locked Daniel's study door. I told myself it was for privacy, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid of what else I might find. When I finally lay down, I could feel the weight of the hidden things pressing through the floorboards: money, lies, missing pages. Somewhere in those numbers was the reason Evelyn vanished. Somewhere was the reason Daniel left me that note in his Bible. Sleep came fitfully, full of strange images. A Bible page bleeding ink, a clock striking Thursday again and again, Evelyn's face turning toward me, her lips forming words I couldn't hear. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I would stop being the polite widow who waited for permission to ask questions. I would find Harris. I would find out what happened in July 2011. Because something was still unfinished. And whatever it was, I was done pretending not to see it. The first Monday after that decision, I drove to the bank. The building sat squat and self-satisfied at the edge of Main Street, all glass and brick, like a promise that money made everything transparent. I parked in Daniel's old spot, the one marked Vice President Emeritus. It felt both defiant and absurd. The receptionist, a young woman with too much eyeliner and too little patience, smiled politely when she saw me. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I replied, "but I believe I should speak with Mr. Palmer." Palmer was the chairman, Daniel's oldest friend, the man who once toasted our anniversary with a grin that lingered too long on my shoulder. She hesitated, then picked up the phone. Within minutes, a junior associate appeared, a man too young to have calluses from guilt. "Right this way, ma'am." The boardroom smelled of toner, lemon polish, and the faint sharpness of coffee that had been reheated one too many times. Palmer stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, framed by the skyline like a painting of authority. "Margaret," he said warmly, "how are you holding up?" "I've been better," I answered, and laid my purse on the table. "There's something I need to ask you." "Of course." "What happened in July 2011? The question startled him. His smile froze, then rearranged itself into the kind that bankers practice in mirrors. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are," I said softly. "I found a memo in Daniel's study, something about a client sweep, a hold until Thursday." Palmer exhaled through his nose, long and slow. "Margaret, I'm sure whatever you found was internal jargon. Your husband handled complex transfers. It's easy to misread those things." I looked at him the way I used to look at students caught cheating, calm, direct, unwilling to pretend. I've taught literature for 40 years. I know when words hide meaning. He shifted, his cufflinks winking in the fluorescent light. "Is this really necessary?" "Yes," I said. "I'm not leaving until I understand what Daniel was involved in and what happened to Evelyn Hart." That name cracked something in his composure. He turned toward the window. "You shouldn't drag up old rumors," he said finally. "It won't bring peace." "Peace isn't what I'm looking for," I said and stood. "Truth will do." When I left, I could feel eyes following me from behind cubicles. In the lobby, the young receptionist avoided meeting my gaze. I walked out into the sunlight that felt too harsh for spring and thought, they're afraid. And fear always points toward guilt. That afternoon, Robert stopped by the house with grocery bags. "Mom, you shouldn't go digging," he said as he set the milk in the fridge. "Dad's gone. The past won't change that." "Maybe not," I said, "but it changes everything else." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I talked to the bank. They said they'll handle the estate, but they need you to sign some foundation documents. It's routine. They just want to release the funds properly." That word again, routine. It scraped against my patience like sandpaper. "I'm not signing anything until I read every line," I said. "Mom, please," he said, frustration edging into his voice. "They said delays could hurt the local scholarships Dad set up. You'd be punishing other families." "I've spent my life serving families," I said. "Don't talk to me about punishment." He stared at me, confused. "What's gotten into you?" "Clarity," I said, "and maybe a little honesty." That night, I found the envelope marked Whitaker Foundation again and opened it under the kitchen light. The documents named me as the primary advisory beneficiary, but all operational control rested with the board with Palmer. If I signed, I'd hand them everything Daniel had left, every cent, every ounce of evidence that could link him or them to wrongdoing. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the envelope. Then I called Harris. He answered on the second ring, his voice still carrying that low drawl that made bad news sound like a favor. "Margaret, been a long time. I need to talk," I said. "It's about Daniel, and about Evelyn Hart." A pause. "I thought that name might resurface someday. You free tomorrow morning?" We met at the diner off Highway 7, the same one where teachers used to gather on paydays. The air smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee. Harris slid into the booth across from me, older now, heavier around the middle, but his eyes still sharp. "Start from the beginning," he said. I told him everything: the note in the Bible, the memo, the earring, the missing ledger page. He didn't interrupt, just scribbled in his small notepad. When I finished, he tapped the pen twice. "Evelyn came to me in 2011, he said quietly. Said she found irregular transfers between the bank's client accounts. Small amounts, barely noticeable. She wanted to report it, but before we could file, she vanished. I never found her. The case was shelved after the board called in favors." My throat tightened. "Do you think, Daniel?" He didn't answer. "I think she trusted the wrong people," he said finally, "and maybe she left something behind to make it right." I told him about the note, the handwriting. He frowned. "Bring it to me tomorrow. We'll look at it together." As I drove home, the sky bruised purple with rain. The first drops hit just as I reached the driveway. Inside, the house felt colder, as if it had been holding its breath. I went to Daniel's study again and noticed the ledger had been moved. Someone had opened the drawer. The faint smell of cologne, not mine, not his, hung in the air. I locked the door behind me and sat in the dark. The Bible and the note were upstairs under my pillow. I realized how easily someone could make them disappear. How easily I could, too. The phone rang Robert again. I didn't answer. I needed quiet. I needed to think. I watched lightning flicker outside, catching the framed photo of our wedding day on the wall. Daniel's smile, young and sure, looked different now, like a man already rehearsing his lies. I thought about Evelyn's cross pendant, the one she always wore, how she never took it off. If she'd truly left town, she would have taken it. But I remembered seeing it once more, years later on Daniel's desk, tucked beneath a paperweight. Maybe that was when she'd stopped being a person and become evidence. When the thunder broke, it startled me into standing. I whispered to the empty room, "You're not done with me yet, are you, Daniel?" The house didn't answer, but I could feel something shifting, a balance tipping. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was a witness, and someone, somewhere, knew I'd begun to remember. They scheduled the will reading for Thursday at 4, as if the week itself took orders from the bank. The boardroom was too bright for grief, blinds pulled to perfect slats, lemon polish and toner making the air sharp. A carafe of coffee steamed beside a stack of cups that turned everything to cardboard. Ethan, the soft-bearded associate who always looked like he was apologizing for the world, arranged folders along the table like a kindergarten teacher, laying out name tags. Palmer stood at the head, hands folded, the posture of a man about to pray over bread he'd already eaten. Robert hovered near the door with his tie loosened, cheeks raw where he'd shaved too fast. "Mom, this is routine," he whispered, relief already rehearsed in his voice. "They'll explain. We'll be done in 20 minutes." Palmer opened a binder and let Daniel's sainthood hang in the air for a respectful half-minute. Then came the business. To ensure continuity of Daniel's philanthropic work, we've prepared the Whitaker Foundation instruments. Margaret, your signature authorizes disbursement to scholarships, the pantry, youth sports. Nothing controversial. Just keeping Daniel's generosity alive. Ethan slid the packet to me. Tabs bloomed. "Sign here." Initial date. My name marched down the pages in pre-printed type. I read the first paragraph once, then twice. Operational control would rest with the executive committee, Palmer's committee. Another clause indemnified officers for good faith errors. A third allowed discretionary transfers to maintain liquidity. I thought of lakes and men who skim them at night. "Why am I an advisory beneficiary only?" I asked. "Best practice," Palmer said, smiling. "You'll have a seat at the table. Like this one?" I tapped the laminate. My knuckle made a hollow sound. Ethan leaned in as if confiding a kindness. "If we sign today, uniforms go out Monday. The Little League's waiting." Uniforms. Boys in borrowed pride. The room had chosen its leverage carefully. I set the packet square with the table's edge and looked up. "Before I sign anything, tell me what happened in July 2011. Something behind Palmer's eyes tightened. He glanced toward the window where the glass reflected his own authority back at him. "Margaret, no one benefits from resurrecting rumor. Truth benefits," I said. "Did Daniel approve client sweeps? Did Evelyn report them? Did the board bury both?" "Mom," Robert said, pain pitching his voice high. "Please." I loved him too much to soften. I asked a question. Palmer closed the binder. The click was small and final. "This meeting concerns estate administration. If you have concerns, outside counsel can schedule something later. Meanwhile, the longer we delay, the more communities lose. It would be a shame for needy families to suffer optics." There it was, the word that turns widows into accomplices, optics. I felt my pulse steady instead of sprint. "Read page 6, paragraph 3, I said, sliding the packet back. "It gives you authority to move assets at your discretion." "Liquidity," Ethan began. "Is the lake," I said. "Yes, I taught metaphor for 40 years. A church acquaintance breezed in on cue, pearls bright, smile powdered. "We're praying for your peace, Margaret. Daniel took such good care of you." Her hand patted mine in practiced compassion, the kind that presses people into silence. In that instant I saw the choreography, the kind words, the tabs, the boys' uniforms, the public plea to be reasonable. I reached for the pen and let it touch the line. The nib squeaked, silly and small, and I watched the whole room exhale as if my consent were already inked. Robert leaned forward like a child glimpsing a passing grade. Even my own hand wanted to hurry, to end the scene neatly. I set the pen down. "I won't sign today," I said, low and clear. The silence that followed had edges. Palmer's nostrils blanched, Ethan's throat bobbed. The churchwoman withdrew, chastened by heat that hadn't yet reached the air. The clock's second hand grew loud. "Margaret," Palmer said evenly, "delays have consequences. So do signatures. Do you mistrust us?" he asked, inviting me to apologize, to be the good woman who keeps men comfortable. "I trust ledgers," I said. "I've seen pages torn out." Robert's face crumpled with that helpless love sons have when their mother stops playing a role they recognize. "This is Dad's legacy," he said. "This is my life," I answered, almost gently. "If the board wants to honor Daniel's intent, it can do so under the regulator's eye, not behind my name." Palmer tried again, softer. "For Robert's sake, for Daniel's memory, for Evelyn's truth," I said, standing. Chairs whispered against carpet. The receptionist in the hall pretended to sort mail. As I reached the door, Palmer said, "Without cooperation, First disbursements cannot proceed. He meant the town would blame me. You'll hold more than disbursements, I said, turning back. You'll hold your breath. I walked the corridor, lined with photos of ribbon cuttings, Daniel smiling, a practiced public joy, and pressed the elevator button with a finger that still remembered guiding chalk along a blackboard. In the lobby's reflection, I looked like any woman, small against glass and brick. But inside, I felt tall. In the parking lot, the wind had a bite. My hands shook so badly the keys chimed against each other like cheap bells. I sat and let the tremor pass. My phone lit with a text from an unknown number. Don't sign. Check the Bible again. No name, no punctuation, just intention. I stared until the letters blurred into river water. At home, I placed my purse on the counter with the care you give an urn. I took the Bible from the nightstand, the leather warm from the lamp's heat, and opened where the card had fallen. The note looked different now, not in words, but in weight. If she finds out, end it before Thursday. I held it under the lamp and saw what my panic had missed, a faint ghost of letters beneath the line, as if another sentence had been pressed and lifted, as if the card had been repurposed. The loop of the F was Daniel's, yes, but along the downstroke sat a pressure mark too neat for his heavy hand, a smaller certainty nested in his flourish. I laid the card on the table, took out the memo I'd found, client sweep, batch C hold until Thursday, and placed them side by side, scripture and arithmetic, threat and routine. In my mind, I saw Evelyn's careful posture at our dinner table years ago, the way she listened with her whole face, the way Daniel praised her pie too many times. I remembered her cross pendant glinting under a paperweight on his desk long after she'd left town. Evidence has a way of lingering where affection pretends to tidy. The refrigerator motor clicked off. The house shifted from hum to hush, the kind of quiet that lets a decision harden. I dialed Harris. "Detective," I said when he answered, and the steadiness in my voice surprised me. "I need you to see something tonight." "Bring it," he said. "I'll make coffee." I slid the card into an envelope with the memo and the picnic photo dated July 2011. I added a page from Daniel's ledger, the one that said, "Sweep completed. Adjust before Thursday." I wrote Thursday in block letters across the front, not for drama but for order, the way teachers label truths so children can find them again. Before I left, I paused at the hallway mirror. My face looked like mine and my mother's and every woman who ever stood up in a room arranged to make her small. I touched the glass the way I used to touch a student's shoulder before handing back an essay. "You were always capable," I told the reflection. "You just forget when men talk." On the porch, the evening felt new, like the minute before rain chooses to fall. I locked the door behind me and stepped into the kind of night that carries voices. Mine was one of them now. When I got home from Harris's house that night, the air felt heavier, as if memory itself had been waiting for permission to return. The folder I'd shown him, Bible note, memo, ledger excerpt, sat open on the kitchen table, the pages trembling slightly under the slow pulse of the ceiling fan. Harris had taken copies, promised he'd cross-check signatures and handwriting, and told me something that wouldn't leave my mind. If Evelyn wrote that card, she was trying to stop something, not start it. Sleep wouldn't come. So I opened the closet in the spare room, the one Daniel used to call storage, and I called the past. Inside were boxes stacked like tombstones. I pulled down the top one, labeled 1,997 taxes and misc. Under a tangle of bank statements and yellowed envelopes sat a smaller box, shoe-sized, its lid covered with my handwriting. Household, divided by Evelyn, divided by old letters. I hadn't touched it in years. Inside were tiny remnants of a life that had felt ordinary while it happened. An old Polaroid from a church bake sale. A dry corsage from a wedding we attended the year Daniel turned 50. And a photo from the annual bank picnic, Evelyn smiling at the camera, Daniel beside her, eyes crinkled, hand hovering just behind her shoulder. On the back, someone me had written July 2011. I could still smell the faint sweetness of sunscreen and lemonade from that day. I had brought potato salad in a blue glass bowl. Evelyn had brought cherry pie again. I'd asked her for the recipe. She promised to write it down. She never did. Under the photos lay a bundle of receipts tied with twine, jewelry sales, home repairs, tuition payments for Robert's graduate degree. I began to flip through, each slip a small confession. March 2003, sold mother's pearls, $2,750. June 2009, roof replacement personal check, $4,480. August 2010, withdrawal, $6,000. Temporary audit discrepancy. I whispered the amounts like prayers. Every line was a moment I'd chosen trust over doubt. Further down, folded into quarters, was a copy of Daniel's handwriting on school stationery, my stationery scribbled with sums. Shortfall $18,400. Maggie's annuity covers gap. Reconcile by Q3. I felt my throat close. I had thought that money long replaced, alone within love, but on the bottom edge, faint pencil marks in smaller loops caught my eye. Tell her before Thursday. The same pattern again. Thursday, always Thursday. I sank into the armchair and let memory spool backward. The year 2011 rose clear as smoke. It was the hottest summer in 20 years. The air itself buzzed. The bank's air conditioning failed twice, and Daniel came home reeking of coffee and stress. He started locking his briefcase even inside the house. When I asked, he smiled and said, "Trade secrets." He was restless at night, pacing, phone lighting, his face blue. I remember one Thursday morning when he left before sunrise. I watched from the window as his taillights disappeared down the street. By noon, the police cars were parked outside the bank. I'd been grading essays when the call came. Evelyn had gone missing, left work mid-morning, purse and phone behind. Daniel told me later that she'd been unstable, that her mother was ill, that she'd probably run off to Raleigh. Everyone accepted it. The papers printed a short notice, 2 paragraphs between the weather and the obituaries. But I remember standing in our kitchen, her recipe card half written on the counter, the smell of cinnamon still faint on her handwriting. That evening Daniel came home late, shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot. I asked what had happened. "She left," he said flatly. "It's sad, but it's done." I asked if she'd said goodbye. She didn't owe me one. The next morning he burned her choir robe in the backyard. I remember the smell, synthetic fabric, and something else, a sweetness that made my stomach twist. When I asked why, he said mildew had ruined it, but it hadn't rained in weeks. After that, we never spoke her name again. The church replaced her alto part quietly, and by autumn she was a rumor people stopped repeating. Now, years later, sitting in that same kitchen, I realized I had been complicit in forgetting. I'd helped bury her beneath politeness and casseroles. I pulled another box from the closet, labeled Daniel, Personal. Inside were old ledgers, the kind with brass corners and lined pages. One had a torn edge where a page had been removed. On the next sheet, in Daniel's neat pen, was the phrase, "Sweep completed, adjust before Thursday." In the margin, another faint line in lighter ink, "Check E's report. E. Evelyn." I pressed my thumb against the page, feeling for indentations. The pressure marks ran deeper than Daniel's usual strokes. Someone had written over his words later, almost carving them in. I carried the ledger to the table, comparing the loops to the card from the Bible. The faint underletters matched the same careful curves, the same smaller hand, Evelyn's hand. She must have seen his ledger, his memos, his pattern of Thursday sweeps. Maybe she realized what he was doing, transferring small sums across client accounts, hiding them under routine maintenance. Maybe she confronted him. And maybe, before she disappeared, she left the only warning she could. That card in the Bible. If she finds out, end it before Thursday. End what? The sweeps? The fraud? The lie? Or her own life? I thought of the night Daniel came home trembling, sweat beading under his collar. He told me a dog chased him on his walk. But later, I found a scrape on his wrist and a torn corner of paper in his pocket ledger paper. I had thrown it away without reading. I pressed my palm against the table until my hand stopped shaking. For the first time in months, maybe years, I said her name aloud. "Evelyn." It came out soft but certain, like lighting a candle in a dark room. I turned to the window. Dawn was coming slow and pink, brushing the magnolia leaves outside. I thought of all the Thursdays that had passed, each one an invisible boundary between ignorance and awareness. Maybe Evelyn had tried to cross it for me. Maybe she had given her life to warn me. I opened the Bible again. A slip of paper I hadn't noticed before was tucked between the back pages, thin, brittle, almost translucent. My pulse kicked. It wasn't Daniel's handwriting or mine. It was Evelyn's. Just 2 words: check, ledger. I exhaled through a laugh that was half sob. The message had waited for 14 years. I gathered every piece: card, memo, ledger, note, and placed them into a manila folder. On the cover I wrote Evelyn's truth. My hands no longer trembled. When Robert called that morning, asking if I'd reconsidered signing, I told him gently, no, not until I finished reading the rest of the story. He didn't understand what I meant, but someday he would. Before hanging up, I looked once more at the card's indentation, at the ghost line beneath Daniel's handwriting. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. Evelyn had written the note. She had seen the danger. She hadn't been warning Daniel. She had been warning me, and now I understood. I closed the folder and said softly to the empty kitchen, I see it, Evelyn. I see it all. The ceiling fan whispered overhead, a quiet applause. Outside, the morning light turned the magnolia leaves silver. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, I felt something close to peace, but not the kind that ends things, the kind that prepares you for what comes next. Tomorrow, I would meet Harris again, and this time I would bring every truth the past still owed me. Harris's kitchen smelled of burnt coffee and old paper. He'd cleared a space at the table between a butter cookie tin and a stack of files, the kind of clutter only men who live alone accumulate. Morning light cut through the blinds in pale stripes, landing across the folder I carried pressed against my chest. Inside were the Bible card, the ledger page, and Evelyn's photo. I laid them on the table carefully, as though truth could bruise. Harris studied the card first. So this is what you found inside Daniel's Bible? Yes, I said. It looks like his handwriting, but something's wrong with it. Too deliberate, like he was copying himself. He turned it under the light. I asked a friend to come by. Retired handwriting analyst. You'll trust her more than me. A soft knock sounded, and he waved her in. Dorothy Price was a small woman in a gray cardigan, white hair cut neat as a ruler line, a magnifier hanging from her neck. You must be Margaret, she said kindly. Let's take a look at that relic. She slid on her glasses, positioned the card under a desk lamp, and leaned close. If she finds out, end it before Thursday. She read aloud. Blue ballpoint, medium tip. Written twice, I'd say same phrase traced over itself. She moved the light sideways until the shadows deepened across the paper. There. You see these faint curves beneath the ink? That's a different pen. And an earlier hand. This card's got 2 writers. I leaned forward. Beneath the bold letters I could just make out ghosts of smaller ones, a delicate E, a narrow N. Dorothy smiled sadly. Your husband overwrote this message. The first line belonged to someone else. Evelyn, I whispered. That'd be my guess, she said. Look here, the upward crossbars, tight spacing, rounded A's. Feminine, precise. She wrote the message first. He traced over it later. Harris exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. So the note wasn't Daniel threatening anyone, it was Evelyn warning someone. I gripped the edge of the table. Warning me. Dorothy adjusted the light again, tilting the page until the ink shimmered. She must have realized what he was doing and tried to leave a message where it couldn't be destroyed. The Bible, your Bible, really was the safest place. He probably found it, copied her line, twisted its meaning, and left the card there to convince himself he'd handled it. She knew he was stealing, I said. The Thursday sweeps. The missing funds. Harris nodded slowly. She came to me in July 2011, he admitted. Said she'd found strange transfers small enough to slip under the radar. Wanted me to take it to the state auditor. Before we could file anything, she vanished. Her car was left at the bank lot. No purse, no goodbye. He looked down at the card again. Now we know why. Dorothy picked up the ledger page next. This margin note, check E's report, same hand as the undertext. That woman left fingerprints in ink everywhere. I swallowed, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee. So Daniel didn't write that card to threaten me. Evelyn wrote it to save me. Harris poured himself another cup and didn't drink it. If she uncovered the embezzlement, your husband might have panicked. Maybe the board leaned on him. Maybe she told him she'd go public if he didn't stop. That line, if she finds out she was warning him, the truth would reach you. End it before Thursday, end the sweeps, stop the fraud, not harm you. She trusted me to find it, I said, more to myself than to them. She knew I'd open that Bible one day. Dorothy slid the card into a clear sleeve and sealed it with tape. You hold on to this. It's evidence and testimony both. Don't let anyone tell you different. For a while, none of us spoke. The clock ticked between us, the kind of steady sound that made everything else seem fragile. Harris finally cleared his throat. What do you want to do now? I want Robert to know the truth, I said. He worshipped his father. He deserves to see the real man behind the sermons. He nodded. And the board? I'll give them a chance to come clean, I said. If they don't, you hand everything to the state. He gave a small, proud smile. I'll be ready. When I left, I drove without music. The world outside looked ordinary, lawns trimmed, mailboxes steady, magnolia leaves shining in late light, but everything inside me was rearranged. I kept replaying Evelyn's last weeks, piecing together fragments, the day she'd stopped coming to choir, the evening Daniel burned her robe, the way he'd said, "She left, it's done." All those Thursdays lined up like ledger entries. At home, I opened Daniel's office again. The ledger still lay where I'd left it, patient as sin. I turned to the next page. There were numbers, neat columns, and at the bottom, a single line in Daniel's unmistakable pen, "Close pending sweep, confirm Thursday." I almost tore the page out, but instead I folded it carefully and added it to my folder labeled Evelyn's Truth. A quiet filled the room, different from loneliness, more like reckoning. I looked around at his trophies, his polished plaques, the framed photo of him shaking hands with the governor. Every surface was dusted. I realized I'd been keeping his memory clean so no one else would have to see the dirt. I took the Bible from the shelf and opened to the page where the card had rested. The indentation was still there, faint but firm. Evelyn's voice, pressed into scripture. I touched it and whispered, "I found it. You can rest now." Then I noticed something new. A scrap of paper, thin as tissue, had slipped between the back pages. It looked like a piece of notepaper torn from a ledger, folded twice. My heart stumbled as I opened it. The handwriting was Evelyn's again, smaller this time, hurried. "Tell Margaret, before it's too late." I sat down hard, both hands over my mouth. The note must have been trapped there all these years, hidden behind the card. The house creaked, as if acknowledging it. I rose slowly, went to the window, and looked out over the yard. The sky was the color of pewter, low and waiting. "Thank you," I whispered. "I'm listening now." When the phone rang, it was Robert. "Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe I should look at those foundation papers again. Something feels off." Relief swept through me so fierce it hurt. "Come over tonight," I said. "There's something I need to show you." After I hung up, I made tea, set 2 cups on the table, and laid the Bible beside them. In the envelope marked Evelyn's Truth, I placed the card, the ledger copy, and the new note. The folder had weight now, not just paper, but justice. For the first time, I felt ready. The story that began as betrayal had become something else entirely, a warning that survived its messenger. When the clock struck 6, thunder rumbled far away, low and steady. I waited for my son, for the conversation that would finally end Daniel's version of our lives. Outside, the magnolia branches bent under the wind, leaves flashing their pale undersides like open palms. I looked at the Bible, at Evelyn's careful words, and said softly, "You did save me." Then I waited for the knock that would begin the rest of my truth. The night after Robert came, the air hung thick with rain. We sat at the kitchen table long after the tea had gone cold, the Bible open between us like a third person. I slid the envelope labeled Evelyn's Truth across the table. He looked at it as if it might bite. "Mom," he said quietly, Whatever this is, are you sure you want to know? I already know, I said. Now you need to. He read the notes one by one, lips moving without sound. The handwriting, the memo, the faint indentation where Evelyn's smaller letters hid beneath Daniel's bolder script, each piece rearranged the man he thought his father was. When he reached the line, "Tell Margaret before it's too late," his face crumpled. "I don't understand," he whispered. He was so careful. He loved us. He loved his reputation more, I said gently. But Evelyn, she tried to stop it. She saved me from becoming his silence. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, softly, "What do we do now?" It was the first time I'd heard him say "we" in months. "We finish what she started," I said. That night I couldn't sleep, so I made lists, the teacher's cure for chaos. One column for documents, one for witnesses, one for what still needed proof. At the top I wrote, Thursday, 9 a.m. Boardroom. Truth. By morning, resolve had found a rhythm. I called Harris and told him I was ready. He said the state regulator had reopened the 2011 audit under new evidence. He'd also arranged a forensic accountant willing to review the transactions pro bono. Her name was Priya, and she worked with women's legal networks that specialized in financial abuse. When she arrived that afternoon, she carried a laptop and a calmness that felt like armor. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said warmly, "I've seen a lot of Daniels in my line of work. They hide behind respectability, but paper never lies." She scanned the ledger copies, typed quickly, cross-referencing the old bank statements I'd kept. "See these transfers?" she said, pointing to a pattern of small withdrawals every Thursday, always rounded to the nearest hundred. Classic skimming, spread thin enough to look like fees, but together it's hundreds of thousands over time. He wasn't working alone. "Palmer," I said. She nodded. "Likely. His signature authorizes most of these entries." She smiled without softness. "We'll need originals for court, but your copies are a good start." I handed her the folder labeled Evelyn's Truth. "This stays safe with you," I said. "If anything happens to me—" She stopped me. "Nothing's happening to you except justice." Hearing it out loud steadied me. That evening, I drove to the bank, parked across the street, and watched the lights go out one by one. Palmer's office stayed lit the longest. When he finally emerged, locking the door behind him, he looked older than I remembered, his gait careful. Guilt ages faster than grief. I followed him only long enough to see him enter the law firm 2 blocks away, briefcase tight against his chest. I didn't need to know what he carried. I already did. Back home, I packed a small bag just in case. A change of clothes, Evelyn's photo, the notebook where I kept my lesson plans. Old habits die, honestly. I couldn't face a confrontation without order. Before bed, I called Harris. "Tomorrow," I said. "I want you there. Bring Priya." "I'll be there at 9 sharp," he replied. "You sure you're ready for this?" "I've been ready since the funeral." The next morning I dressed simply: a navy blouse, black skirt, my mother's small gold brooch at the collar. Rain had started again, steady and cleansing. The house hummed with the smell of damp wood and courage. Robert waited by the door in his old gray suit. His tie was crooked, and I reached up to fix it, just like when he was a boy. "Mom," he said, voice thick, "whatever happens, I'm proud of you." "Good," I said. "Be proud of yourself, too. You're choosing truth." We drove in silence to the bank. The building loomed, glass and brick pretending to be transparency. In my purse were copies of the documents, labeled and numbered. My fingers traced the envelope edges like worry beads. Inside, Palmer and 2 other board members sat at the long table. The same coffee carafe steamed beside the same disposable cups. He smiled the way men do when they think the outcome is predetermined. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "back so soon? I hope we can resolve this without unpleasantness." "Unpleasantness depends on how honest you plan to be," I replied. Before he could respond, Harris entered, raincoat dripping, followed by Priya with her laptop case. The room's air shifted. Palmer's smile faltered. Harris set his folder on the table. "Before we begin," he said evenly, "I should inform you that the state regulator has reopened the 2011 audit. Any attempt to alter or destroy records after this point will be treated as obstruction. Silence spread like ink in water. Priya powered on her laptop, the whirring fan the only sound. "We've traced transactions across multiple client accounts," she said calmly. "The transfers align perfectly with internal memos bearing your signature, Mr. Palmer, and with Daniel Whitaker's." She turned the screen toward him, columns of dates, amounts, destinations. "This is the pattern of theft. And this," she added, holding up the Bible card in its clear sleeve, "is the pattern of conscience that tried to stop it." Palmer's jaw clenched. "You can't prove." "I can," I interrupted, "because I lived with the man who did it." Robert looked between us, eyes wide but resolute. "Mr. Palmer," he said, voice steady, "I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. You should too." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rain against the windows. Then Palmer exhaled, long and slow. "You have no idea what you're inviting, Margaret. Scandal destroys families." "No," I said. "Lies do." He gathered his papers, but Harris's hand landed on them first. "Not this time," the detective said. "These go to the state." When the meeting ended, the rain had stopped. The sky outside was pale, the color of clean pages. On the steps of the bank, Robert turned to me. "What now?" "Now," I said. "We finish Evelyn's work, and then we give her name back." That evening I sat at the table again, the house quiet except for the steady tick of the clock. I wrote a letter short, deliberate to the local newspaper editor. "To whom it may concern, for 14 years this town believed a good man left behind a spotless legacy. It's time you learned whose name paid for that illusion." I signed it simply, Margaret Whitaker. I sealed the envelope and looked at the Bible one last time. The pages still smelled faintly of lilies from the funeral. I whispered, "Tomorrow, Evelyn, we'll tell them everything." The clock struck 9. Thursday was only hours away. Thursday morning broke sharp and clear, the sky washed clean after rain. I dressed simply navy blouse, gray skirt, my mother's gold brooch at the collar. My reflection in the mirror looked calm, almost unfamiliar. Robert waited by the car, holding the folder marked Evelyn's Truth. He didn't speak, and neither did I. Some silences are too full to break. At 9, we entered the bank together. The same glass lobby, the same polite receptionist pretending not to stare. My heels clicked against the marble floor with a steadiness that didn't feel like courage, only decision. Palmer and his lawyer were already in the boardroom, the smell of lemon polish and stale coffee floating over the conference table like memory. He smiled the way guilty men do, polite, exhausted, rehearsed. "Margaret," he said smoothly, "I hoped you'd reconsider. There's no need to make this unpleasant." "Then you'll appreciate how quietly I can speak," I answered. Harris arrived a minute later, followed by Priya, briefcase in hand, eyes sharp behind her glasses. She set up her laptop without greeting anyone. "Before we begin," she said, "the state regulator is joining us by phone." She pressed a button on a small speaker. "Miss Tran, can you hear us?" "Yes," came the voice, firm, official. "Proceed." Palmer cleared his throat. "I fail to see why this circus is necessary. These are private estate matters." Harris placed a recorder on the table. "Not anymore. You're being recorded." The red light blinked between us. I laid the card from the Bible on the table, its clear plastic sleeve reflecting the overhead lights. "You all know this handwriting," I said. "It looks like Daniel's, but it isn't entirely. A forensic analyst proved a woman's hand lies beneath it, Evelyn Hart's." Palmer's eyes flicked to the card, then away. "That's absurd." "No," I said quietly. "It's proof. Evelyn discovered your client sweeps small transfers moved every Thursday, signed by my husband and approved by you. When she tried to report it, she vanished. She wrote this note as a warning to me, not a threat." Priya opened her laptop, the glow lighting her composed face. "These are the transaction records," she said, scrolling. "Repeated withdrawals in even sums, marked maintenance. Over 12 years, these movements total nearly $800,000. She looked up. "Every Thursday, every time your signature, Mr. Palmer." The lawyer adjusted his tie. "Speculation. Maintenance sweeps are standard practice." Not into private holding accounts labeled under shell vendors, Priya interrupted. She tapped another key. This account belongs to your nephew's consulting firm. The room went still. Even the hum of the projector faded into memory. Harris leaned forward. You told me in 2011 there were no irregularities. Evelyn gave me a folder with flagged statements. It vanished after the board met with counsel. You called me a friend and lied to my face. Palmer's jaw worked. You're twisting old audits. Daniel was managing liquidity. He protected this town. I looked at him steadily. He protected himself. And you. Robert spoke up then, his voice tight but clear. Mr. Palmer, my father taught me integrity mattered more than comfort. If what you're saying is true, show us the records. Show us what he was protecting. Palmer didn't answer. He stared at the card, then at the regulator's speaker. You can't prove intent, he muttered. No one can. Miss Tran's voice came through, calm and cold. Intent is inferred through repetition, Mr. Palmer. The evidence meets that standard. You and Daniel Whitaker will both be named in the investigation. Your cooperation now will determine how public this becomes. He swallowed, his face turning the color of paper. You'll ruin this town? He said finally. No, I replied. You already did. I'm just naming what you built. Harris slid an envelope across the table. These are copies of statements you altered after 2011. We traced the edits to your credentials. The lawyer started to protest, but Palmer's hand shot up. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small, just an old man who'd confused power with permanence. What do you want from me, Margaret? He asked. The truth, I said. And Evelyn's name cleared. You'll admit she told the truth before you erased her. The foundation money will be redirected to a women's shelter. Her shelter. He exhaled, long and hollow. You'll destroy Daniel's reputation. He destroyed it himself, I said. I'm giving it purpose. The clock ticked loudly, the kind of sound that marks the end of things. Palmer leaned back in his chair, eyes darting between us. I need counsel, he whispered. You have one, Harris said dryly, and you'll have more after this meeting. Priya closed her laptop. Everything recorded will be submitted to the state by end of day. The public report follows next week. She turned to me. You did the right thing, Mrs. Whitaker. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The air in the room had changed lighter but strange, as if truth itself took up new space. Robert stood and rested his hand on my shoulder. Mom, he said softly. I'm sorry. For what? For not seeing him sooner. I covered his hand with mine. You couldn't. I barely did, and I lived beside him. Palmer rose slowly, gathering the papers that no longer belonged to him. I'll issue a statement, he murmured, but his voice was already the sound of defeat. We left the boardroom together. The hallway smelled faintly of rain from someone's umbrella. Outside, sunlight cut through the clouds, and the pavement shimmered like wet glass. A cluster of reporters waited near the steps. Word travels fast in small towns. Harris stepped forward to shield me, but I didn't need it. When one of them asked, Mrs. Whitaker, is it true the late vice president was involved in embezzlement? I met her eyes and answered simply, it's true he was involved in a woman's courage, and it cost her life. Now we'll make sure it matters. Their pens stilled for a beat before scribbling. The truth had its own headline now. Robert guided me to the car, but I stopped before getting in. Across the street, children in Little League uniforms were practicing, their laughter cutting through the noise of cameras. One boy's jersey read Whitaker Insurance. I watched him throw the ball too high, then laugh when he missed the catch. That joy was still possible, maybe even honest. As we drove away, the radio filled with a weather report about a cold front clearing the county. Robert turned it down, glancing at me. What happens next? Justice, I said, and then peace. He nodded slowly. You think Dad would understand? I looked out the window at the bank shrinking in the rearview mirror. Maybe not, I said, but Evelyn would. At home, I set the Bible back on the kitchen table and placed the card beside it, still in its clear sleeve. The blue ink caught the afternoon light, and for the first time, it looked less like a warning and more like a promise fulfilled. I made tea while the house settled around me. Outside, the magnolia leaves glistened. Inside, the clock ticked like a heart that had found its right rhythm. Thursday at last had kept its word. The morning after the confrontation, the town felt quieter, like a stage after the final bow. Headlines bloomed before sunrise. Whitaker Bank under investigation for long-term fraud. My name appeared only once, small but clear, the widow who exposed it. I didn't need more. Truth doesn't require applause, it just needs light. I sat on the porch with my cup of tea, watching mist rise from the magnolia leaves. Across the street, children on bicycles shouted over the rattle of chains, unaware that their scholarships would now come from an honest fund. Somewhere downtown, Palmer was likely rehearsing his statement, crafting a sentence that would use words like mismanagement and oversight instead of theft. I hoped his conscience would keep him company. Robert joined me, 2 steaming mugs in hand. He hadn't shaved, his eyes red from another sleepless night, but something softer had replaced his grief. "You were right," he said. "Dad built a legacy on the backs of people who trusted him. I think he started small, telling himself he'd fix it later. That's how ruin begins," I said quietly. "A man convinces himself he's the exception." He sat beside me, the wooden steps creaking under our weight. "The regulators called this morning. They're freezing the board's assets. They might recover enough to rebuild the programs." I nodded. "Good. Then at least the money will finally do what it was supposed to." He hesitated. "They also asked about the foundation name. You said you wanted to change it." "Yes." I sipped my tea, letting the warmth settle. "I'm renaming it Evelyn's House. A shelter for women who don't get warnings in time. She saved me. The least I can do is give her a door with her name on it." Robert looked out at the yard, voice breaking a little. "She must have been terrified." "She was brave," I said. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing while you're still trembling." The wind shifted, carrying the faint chime of the church bell down the street. For a moment, I imagined Evelyn standing there the way she'd looked the night of that church dinner years ago, hands folded, smile quiet but knowing. I hoped she'd forgive me for taking so long to understand. By noon, Harris called to tell me Palmer had resigned. The board members were cooperating, offering files they'd once sworn didn't exist. "It'll take months," he said, "but you lit the fuse. They can't bury it now." "Good," I said. "Just make sure Evelyn's name stays in the record." He laughed softly. "Already done. You might be surprised how many women on the audit team insisted on it." After we hung up, I went to Daniel's study one last time. The room was too neat, too staged, like a man's photograph of his own virtue. His trophies gleamed dully on the shelf, the word integrity engraved on one of the plaques, catching the light with unintended irony. I touched the surface, then let my fingers fall away. On his desk sat the same brass paperweight where I'd once seen Evelyn's cross pendant. I lifted it. Beneath it was only dust and an old note written in Daniel's handwriting. "Balance before Thursday." I folded it and placed it in the trash. That ledger was closed. I took the Bible from the shelf and opened to the empty space where the card had once been. The indentation of her letters was still faintly visible, as if pressed into the paper's memory. I whispered, "It's over." The house didn't answer, but I swear the air moved lighter, as if someone finally exhaled. That afternoon, I drove to the community center to meet with Priya and the legal team. They'd already reserved a small office for the new foundation. A handmade sign leaned against the door. "Evelyn's House opening soon." I stood there a long time, tracing the painted letters with my eyes until they blurred. Inside, Priya was sorting boxes. "You sure you're up for all this?" she asked with a smile. "I'm 72, I said. "I've spent a lifetime teaching children to tell the truth. It's about time I built something for the women who never got to." She handed me a document. "You'll need to sign here official transfer of funds from the estate to the new trust. No loopholes this time." I signed my name carefully, the ink smooth and final. No hesitation, no trembling. The pen didn't squeak. When I left, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky a tender orange. I drove past the park where the Little League practiced. The boys were laughing again, their uniforms a brighter shade of blue, as if even fabric could feel relieved. At home, I cooked dinner for the first time in weeks. Nothing fancy: soup, bread, a bit of salad. Robert joined me, setting the table quietly. When we sat down, I noticed how his shoulders had lost that weight they carried since the funeral. Between us on the table was the old Bible, its leather now soft from years of use and grief. We ate mostly in silence. At one point he said, "You know, Mom, I used to hate Thursdays. They always felt cursed." I smiled. Maybe now they can belong to someone else. After he left, I poured a glass of wine and stepped out to the porch again. Fireflies had begun to spark over the grass, small lanterns of forgiveness. Across the street, the lights in the church flickered on for choir practice. I could almost hear Evelyn's alto somewhere in that harmony, clear and steady. I opened the letter I'd written for tomorrow's paper, my final statement. To those who knew Daniel Whitaker, remember him as you will, but also remember Evelyn Hart, who told the truth when silence was safer. Her voice reached me across 14 years. Because of her, no one else will be lost to Thursdays. I sealed it, placed it by the door for the morning mail, and returned to the chair with my tea. For the first time in a long while, I let my mind rest. The storm had passed. The house no longer listened for ghosts. Somewhere beyond the trees, a train horn echoed faintly. Daniel used to count every whistle before sleep. Tonight, I didn't count. I just listened not to loss, but to continuation. When I closed my eyes, I pictured Evelyn walking through a doorway filled with light, her cross pendant catching the sun, her lips curved in something like peace. "Thank you," I whispered. "You can rest now." And as the night settled soft and full around me, I realized I could too. If this story touched you, please don't forget to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Until next time, remember, truth may sleep, but it never dies.